And of course, this is part of a larger effort globally through this period around World Water Day. And so it's very nice to see that groundwater is actually getting very high on the agenda, and people are taking it to the heart. They're trying to understand it and making it visible. And yeah, basically we are sort of getting groundwater on par with surface water, if you like, is sort of the role that groundwater plays for Africa's resilience and socioeconomic transformation, and how that can actually take place. I think it spills very much over from what Richard was talking about in the previous talk, the question of unlocking the potential of groundwater. And I think there's nowhere in the world where this is more relevant than in Africa. So this is, of course, some of what I'll be discussing here. So this is a report that we all are focusing on, and I just wanted to highlight that last week, during World Water Day, the report was launched sort of physically in Senegal, in Dakar, during the 9th World Water Forum. And there was good attention to it, and there were several sessions dealing with groundwater. We had high-level panels and other sessions that dealt with groundwater. And it was very nice because it was in the flesh. It was face-to-face. And I think for many of us, it was the first time since 2 years that we were able to meet again. So for other reasons, it was also a celebration. Now, so my outline is sort of briefly the role of groundwater in meeting Africa's development challenges and the potential of groundwater across Africa. And then also talking about some recent high-level engagement in groundwater for sustainable development in Africa that I've been part of, and I think is very positive and sort of leading the way on the continent. So I think we all know the world is on its edge. We have climate change, we have biodiversity degradation, and land degradation and pollution, biodiversity loss, and so on. Africa is no different. It's also impacted by all these factors. And with population growth, of course, this is just being compounded. So briefly, population growth, you can see here to the right that Africa is leading the way here in terms of explosion of population. The financing, generally speaking, not only for water and sanitation, is inadequate. So Africa is sort of lagging behind on a lot of the development goals. And of course, as we know, Africa is one of the continents where we probably have more representatives of people that don't have access to safely managed water and sanitation. That goes without saying, I think. And the capacity is fairly low, especially when we talk about management and development of groundwater. And I'll come into more details on that. I think it's important also to highlight that there's more of a physical water stress when we talk about North Africa, whereas in sub-Saharan Africa, we're more talking about economic water scarcity. And with that, we mean that the water is basically there under the feet also, but there's not enough investments to get access to it. And so that's why there's water insecurity mainly in those areas. And as a fallout of that, we also have food insecurity, of course. There's very little irrigation. I'll be showing some of those data and how groundwater can come in as well. And you can see here to the right that sub-Saharan Africa is also topping the countries or the regions with most food insecurity. And then climate change, of course, is making all of these development challenges even more difficult. I think we mostly focus on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, but I think it's also important to say that for Africa, they have their own development agenda, so to speak. And if you look across these, I'm not going to read them aloud, but many of them are actually highly focusing on water and water security. These go back to 2015 and all the way to basically till now. and the last one is looking towards 2063. So this is a long-term horizon in terms of reaching some of these goals. I like this photo because it sort of illustrates that water resources is not two-dimensional, it's three-dimensional. And the third dimension is, of course, the groundwater under our feet. And if we look at it here, it's very visible. But of course, normally we don't see it, and that's why we forget it. But just showing this is really sort of illustrative of the amount of water that we have under us that we need to also take into account. I mentioned the SDGs, and I like to see groundwater as being sort of cross-cutting across many of the SDGs in terms of achieving them. And of course, water supply and sanitation is key when we talk about Africa, but also for other aspects, I think groundwater will be becoming even more important in Africa, especially for climate change adaptation, because Africa is one of the continents that are most hardly hit by climate change, with the largest variability in water availability and so on. It will only increase, and against the level of water security from water supply and so on, this just makes the problems even worse. And groundwater has a large role to play in this as well. I'll come back to that. For regional integration and cooperation, we have our transboundary aquifers. I'll come back to that also, which are important to actually also bring groundwater more to the center stage in terms of political attention. It makes groundwater more visible when we deal with it at high political level. For ecosystem services, also very important. I'll give some examples of that. And then lastly, but not least, the food security aspects. So just quickly on the potential of groundwater across Africa. Richard already mentioned that there's a way that we can distinguish between different parts of Africa. Some areas are endowed with a lot of recharge because of high rainfall. That's to the right. You can see the blue areas, whereas other areas are endowed with a lot of water storage. And you can see that to the right. And that's mostly in the arid areas. And that storage is mostly fossil water. And so we have different contexts of groundwater in Africa that we need to take very clearly into account when we try to manage it and develop it. And I think it's important to say again that there are significant resources that are not developed, even where the resources are relatively poor, shallow, hard rock aquifers. Even in those places, there's enough groundwater to supply water enough for local and rural communities, and even for small-scale irrigation. So there's a big need to invest in those factors. I think they say that there's about 20 times more groundwater than there is replenished in rivers and lakes, and there's 100 times more groundwater in Africa when you compare it to the storage and in rivers and lakes. So it's quite substantial, but you can see the diversity and the distribution is quite significant. Groundwater for wash. I think it's very important to say, as I said already, that water security is very poor. It's influencing the poorest people. The rural populations are the ones that are worst off in terms of coverage of safe water supply and sanitation. You can see here the women, the young girls, and even small girls are dealing with water on a daily scale and spending a lot of time on it. And even under COVID-19, this came through even more because people were basically lacking water for hygiene, and also they were affected through their food security and so on because of less trade and so on. So all of these things kind of tied together. Also for urban settlements, groundwater is becoming more and more important, and Richard already mentioned the self-supply and so on that is now happening, and that needs much more attention in terms of management and in terms of making it equitable, so that it's not only the rich communities that are able to drill deep boreholes and secure their access. And of course, contamination is an issue. I think Richard also mentioned that in Africa, we're talking very much contamination from sanitation. That's why we see a lot of waterborne diseases. So there's this cross contamination of from sanitation into the water supply, which are causing a lot of death toll in Africa. And part of that is due to improper protection of groundwater, but also improper protection of the supply from the groundwater source to the household and in the household. Now to the food security, you can see here the direct comparison between South Asia and Africa, how little irrigation is actually taking place in Africa. And to the right here, we did some assessments of the potential if we only looked at the replenishable groundwater, not the fossil groundwater that we saw before. So basically where we have enough rainfall to also supply groundwater in excess of what is needed for domestic and so on. And this is what we came up with. There's good potential in this stretch north to south in the eastern part of the continent and also in the Sahel. Even in some parts of Sahel, groundwater levels are rising because the land use change has changed from deep-rooted natural vegetation to shallow-rooted crops. And that means that less water is evaporated, and so groundwater tends to increase. So there's a good potential in many of these areas. You can also see the southern and northernmost parts of Africa where groundwater development has already taken place to the limit, basically, and there's not scope for more development for irrigation, and it's actually becoming an issue, and more fossil groundwater is also being used, as well as other sources. Now, for climate change, as I mentioned, Africa is very severely hit by climate change, and so there's more emphasis now on how to include groundwater as part of the strategies towards resilience and climate change adaptation. And part of that has to do with managing recharge and managing natural recharge in the fields and in the recharge areas, but also in cities that are now growing. Water is becoming scarce, especially in Southern Africa, for instance, where we see, for instance, Windhoek and so on, that have really taken on board managed aquifer recharge to increase the water security and make the population safe in terms of water supply, even during several number of years of droughts. And here's just to mention where we have sort of MAR schemes, but there's a lot of scope for that as we go forward, both as you can see here, very rudimentarily and simple means to hold back water and get it underground, to much more advanced tools. Yeah. Okay, I think I should speed up to get finished within my time, but I'm getting to the end. So groundwater for regional integration has to do with the transboundary aquifers. And you can see here to the left how the river basins are sort of intersecting these aquifers in very complicated patterns. But just to say that we need to manage both the transboundary aquifers as well as the international river basins conjunctively. And I think that's where we see a lot of advancement in Africa. Africa is actually quite advanced in terms of dealing with their transboundary waters. And so other countries can look to Africa, how far they have developed in terms of that. And groundwater is becoming a critical part of that. Groundwater for ecosystem services, that was also mentioned. I'm just showing an example here from Southern Africa around the Okavango Delta, where you can see how groundwater is coming in very differently. The lower one has a lot of base flow. The top one has hardly any base flow. And it just shows that you can have very different settings in terms of how much groundwater contributes to ecosystems, to groundwater dependent ecosystems, and to the services that they contribute. So we need to understand this much better also in Africa. And finally, mentioning the work that is taking place at the moment, we have AMCOW, the African Ministers' Council on Water, which is an apex body in Africa working on coordinating and guiding and supporting member states in terms of water for water supply and sanitation, but also water resources. And they have now developed a groundwater program specifically. And also last week, we launched a white paper related to groundwater for Africa's resilience and socioeconomic transformation. And it very much built on what I have been talking about today. So bringing the message to high-level stakeholders, to the financiers and so on, that we need to put more funding into groundwater in Africa. And this is the programmatic approach. I won't be going into too much details, just saying that we are a large number of partners that are supporting AMCOW in this process, and also working with the various countries through different tools and capacity development programs and so on. So my conclusions, groundwater is a cross-cutting issue in achieving SDGs and other development goals across Africa. There's still good groundwater development potential in Africa, but it's region specific, and we need to understand that. There's a need for a precautionary, participatory, gender-sensitive, and resilience-focused approach. And AMCOW is spearheading a momentum on groundwater for development in Africa, and capacity is in high demand. We really need to put more emphasis on that. And also the financing, as I mentioned, to really develop the resource where it is needed the most. And just to mention that I'm working with the Groundwater Solutions Initiative for Policy and Practice, which is a partnership of 30 partners working on groundwater for sustainable development with a lot of focus on Africa as well. So thank you for your attention.